So if you were here last Sunday, you might remember that I mentioned that we all have a fear of something, especially spiders and snakes. The fear of spiders is called arachnophobia, and the fear of snakes is called, ophidiophobia. Ophidiophobia. Do you know what the fear of a clown chasing you with a chainsaw is? Common sense. Last week, we looked at faith versus fear and how faith can overcome whatever level of fear we may experience, from harmless little bugs and dirty utensils to sickness and death. If you didn't see it and would like to, it is up on our Facebook page, on our web page, as well as our YouTube channel. Now, toxic fear is a liar and a destroyer. And if left to its own devices, fear can control our behaviors. Fear can run our lives, and fear can ruin our lives and ruin the lives of others. Fear can be pretty powerful. But the truth is that while fear is debilitating and paralyzing, it can also be a motivator, a call to action, and a call to seek and lean on God. So again, the truth is fear can be debilitating and paralyzing, but it can be a motivator. It's a call to action and a call to seek and lean on God, especially in troubling times. And that means that fear can either be destructive or constructive, or both at the same time. The bottom line is fear can be a teacher or a culprit, both at the same time. Now, tomorrow evening begins the Jewish holiday of Purim. And Purim celebrates the victory of the faithful during a fearful and dangerous time in Jewish history. That's tomorrow night. So today we're going to revisit the ancient Persian Empire and the divinely orchestrated salvation of the Jewish people from the diabolical schemes of Haman. And as we examine the Old Testament book of Esther, notice that fear is constantly defeated by faith. Throughout the book, fear is defeated by faith. And that's because, as Jesus says in John chapter 5, verse 17, "My Father is always working, and so am I." My Father is always working, he's always there, and so am I. Jesus is always there. Now, Esther's story is retold every year in Jewish homes and synagogues, so as to remember God's active presence, provision, protection, and promises, even if we don't see it, even if we can't see it. I used to celebrate this all the time when I was really young. We used to go to synagogue, and I used to watch the pageantry of people, young ladies, dressing up as Esther, winning prizes. I was quite young, probably 4 or 5, and when my sister won a prize, I was so jealous. I could have been Haman. But you'll find out more about Haman later. Okay, I find it ironic today that this belief and denial of God's existence is upheld even when it's obvious that God is working in the background and through all the storms of life. He's there. If we look for it, we'll find it. Because in this case, believing is seeing. And if you think about it, it's even more ironic that God's getting kicked out of all those places where he's needed the most. That's so ironic. We need him so desperately, especially in these places, and we're kicking him out. Now, I like to call Esther, the book of Esther, the book of irony. The book of irony, because we find God's providence quietly threaded throughout the story, throughout the irony in the story. And irony isn't really funny, but yet we often laugh. Check out these ironic photos. And here are some thought-provoking ironies upon which to ponder. Why does the man who invests our money get called a broker? Why does Sweden's famous ice hotel have to have smoke and fire detectors? Why are goods transported on ships called shipments when goods transported on trucks and trains, they're called cargo when they're transported on trucks and trains, and they're called shipments? I never got that one. Here's one. In 1974, the U.S. government issued badges to promote safety with toys. They had to recall 80,000 of them because the pins didn't close properly and they were poking people. They should have stuck with the stick ones, right? And finally, and you may not know this, but why is the Bible the most shoplifted book in America? You know, in one of those pages it says, "Thou shalt not steal," and it's the most shoplifted book in America. Listen, irony makes us sit up and take notice because it emphasizes and points out some specific data that we want to be looking at. That's what irony does. Anybody ever hear of O. Henry, the writer? If you haven't, you should read some of his books because they're all ironic and they're funny. And in the case of Esther, it's ironic that there's not a single mention of God anywhere in the book. Not a single mention, even though he's working nonstop, controlling all the circumstances. He's thwarting all the evil schemes. It's hard for us to notice, but our God is running things from behind the scenes. He is there, constantly working. My Father is always working, and so am I. So we're going to travel back to 5th century Persia, into the Old Testament book of Esther, which was about 400 years after Jonah, but 500 years before Jesus was born. And Esther reads like one of those mystery books that we like to buy at the store. Because we're going to find heroes, we're going to find villains seeking property, pride, prestige, and money. We're going to see political intrigue driven by pride, ego, and arrogance, as well as chaos, hatred, manipulation, and divisiveness. That's what we're going to find throughout the book. But here's a good reminder for us from Romans 8:28. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Now, Purim is a Hebrew word for lots, which is a type of dice. So Purim is also called the Festival of Lots. And that name arises from the fact that the villains in the story cast lots. They cast dice to decide the exact date for the extermination of all the Jews in the empire. But we could also call it the Festival of Irony because it's filled with two types of it. But we do know that the die was cast for what they wanted to do. And there's two types of irony that we're going to find. One is a clash of anticipation versus outcome. And that's the results are entirely different than the one that's expected. And I define that as man plans and God laughs. Anybody ever experience your own plans and then they don't happen, but something better happens because God was in charge, but you didn't know it? And the second is dramatic irony, where truth becomes apparent to a person oblivious to the obvious. Someone who's strikingly unaware of what's going on and becomes caught in their own web. So that's the type of irony we're going to find in the book of Esther. And we're going to do some quick background. This happened 50 years after the second exile of the Jews. The first was by the Assyrians, the second by the Babylonians. I can remember that because A comes before B. And the Persians overthrew Babylon. By the way, this was prophesied that this was going to happen. It was prophesied by 5 Old Testament prophets before it actually happened, by Isaiah, by Jeremiah, by Ezekiel, by Hosea, and by Zephaniah. Now, King Cyrus allowed the Hebrews to return to Israel, but many chose to remain in Persia because they'd become citizens, and it was now their home. And while many of them may have been hobbits, others were fearful of the hardships of revitalizing and rebuilding a land decimated and destroyed by conflict. But for whatever reason, they opted to stay in the comfort and safety and security of their new adopted land. And that's ironic because unbeknownst to them, well, we'll tell you about that later. We don't want to give away the story yet. The main characters in the story are the Persian king Ahasuerus, also known in Hebrew as Xerxes. And then there's the evil, wicked, no good, blow your own horn, chief of princes, Haman, who manipulated his way into great power. Then there's the wonderful, wonderful Mordecai, Esther's much older cousin, father figure, mentor, and advisor. And that brings us to our sweet, humble, and obedient, but tough heroine, Esther, the beautiful Jewish orphan who was raised by the courageous, by the brave Mordecai. So this morning is just an overview of this timeless story. So let me urge you to read it. Read it yourselves, but please read it at home and not while I'm preaching. And one last thing before we get started. This is an interactive sermon when I deliver every couple of years. When retelling the Purim story, it's traditional that whenever Mordecai's name is mentioned, we cheer, but we boo when we hear Haman's name. So we're going to practice for a moment. Okay, when I raise my hands is when I say Mordecai, and you'll say, yay! Yay! Well, that's kind of weak. Let's do that again. Yay! All right. And when we hear Haman, we give a boo or we give a, wait a minute. Strawberry. Are you ready? Haman. Okay. Okay. Let's get into chapter 1. We're going to cover just some survey stuff first before we get to the actual scripture. But in chapter 1, we learned that King Xerxes was prideful, boo, egotistical. Boo. No, he's Xerxes. He's not Haman. And I didn't raise my hands. Yeah. Okay. So he was prideful, egotistical, arrogant, and he was extravagant. He threw a banquet to show off, ready, this is what Scripture reads, the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for 6 months. He had a 6-month party. And he followed this, are you ready, with a week-long after party. An after party filled with immodesty and debauchery. And the politically correct writer of Esther tells us that Xerxes was in high spirits or merry with wine. Now, if I was translating it, I would say that he was smashed. He was tanked. He was stewed, hammered, or he was just plain drunk. Now, Xerxes' queen Vashti was having her own little drunken party at the same time. So she was probably tipsy herself. And the pickled king, ignoring the personal modesty that their culture demanded, ordered Vashti to parade her loveliness before her fraternity brothers. This was a no-no in their culture, but the king was drunk. Now, if you've ever been that tipsy, you'll know you do things you're not supposed to do. Or am I the only one? But Vashti, perhaps emboldened by the source, refuses to be so degraded. She says, I ain't going. And whatever the reason, her disobedience brought public disgrace and humiliation to Xerxes. Ironically, one of the most powerful men in the known world was so easily disobeyed. Men, let that be a lesson to you. Furious, he seeks counsel from the advisors that he has of what's to be done. And ladies, I'm only the messenger here. Okay, so don't shoot me. This was the advice given to the king in chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility will have heard about the queen's conduct, and they will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Ironically, these mighty men filled with political power are frightened of their wife's behavior. And King Xerxes follows his counselor's advice, and he dethrones Vashti, and he banishes her from his sight, from his presence. And next he holds a beauty pageant to find his new queen. And Esther finds herself in the running. Esther's Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle. Esther is so much easier to say than myrtle, so we're going to stick with that. Now, Uncle Mordecai. Yay. Really? Yay. Uncle Mordecai was... He must be a drummer. Came in a little late. Mordecai was well aware of the dangers of being a Jew and tells Esther to keep her heritage under wraps. So Xerxes is unaware that he's fallen in love with a Jewess and makes her the new queen. But then, just like a daytime soap that some of us used to watch, subplots occur. Just by happenstance, cousin Mordecai, coincidentally, just by happenstance, just so hears a conspiracy to assassinate King Xerxes and tells Esther. She informs the king and the culprits are hanged. And the king is exceedingly grateful. He gives Mordecai official credit in the king's royal records. But then for some unknown reason, he actually forgets to honor and reward him. Okay, we're going to move 4 years later into chapter 3. Enter Haman. Haman, a descendant of the Amalekites, the sworn enemy of Israel. Haman, the egotistical. Haman, the ambitious. Haman, the cruel Sith Lord, manipulates Xerxes and gains great influence. He weasels himself into becoming Xerxes' most trusted advisor and lands the number 2 position in all the land. And then Xerxes commands that all bow down to honor him. But Mordecai, being a devout Jew, refused to bow down to Haman, since that's akin to worshiping him. Haman, the prideful, Haman, the cruel Sith Lord, took it personally. And in a rage, decided that it wasn't enough just to kill Mordecai. He's going to rid the entire empire of every last Jew. Slaying them all is his revenge for the slight he felt. Let's read. This is Esther chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pur, that is, the lot, in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month. And the lot fell in the 12th month, the month of Adar. Haman, the devious, then bribes King Xerxes with 375 tons of silver. That's the equivalent of millions of dollars. And he did this to eradicate a group of people who refuses to honor the king and his court by not bowing down. How could King Xerxes refuse? He issues an irrevocable royal edict. All royal edicts were irrevocable for the annihilation of every Jewish man, woman, and child. And then have all their property seized. See, King Xerxes is unaware that he just signed the death warrant, the death sentence, for his beloved Queen Esther as well. Mordecai learns of the scheme, and he gets word to Esther to get the fix in with the king. But Esther is afraid. She is fearful. This is chapter 4, verses 10 through 12. Then Esther told Hathach, to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. Mordecai Mordecai explains that even her position is not going to save the queen. So Esther requests her fellow Jews to fast for 3 days. And she and her entourage will do the same. And to do this before she approaches the queen, because she's fearful. So she's asking the faithful to fast. Now, when Esther approaches the king, he incredibly holds out the golden scepter to her. I wish I had one that I could do that for, but they were too expensive. So, then she sets in motion her strategy to save her people by inviting King Xerxes and Haman, the devilish, to the first of 2 banquets. After the first feast, after the first banquet, Xerxes just so happens to suffer from divine insomnia. Now, Ambien hadn't been invented yet. There were no sleeping potions or pills. So Xerxes has the royal record read to him. Now that's a great sleep aid, isn't it? And it just so happens, coinky-dink, that the story of Mordecai saving the king's life is read. And Xerxes realizes that he's neglected to properly reward and honor Mordecai. And the irony continues as later that morning, Haman strides in to ask the king for permission to hang Mordecai on a huge 75-foot gallows that he had built just for this occasion. This guy, Haman, was just ticked at Mordecai, wasn't he? But before Haman has a chance to render his request, King Xerxes asks him what should be done for a man whom the king wants to honor greatly. Let's read what passes through the mind of Haman, the arrogant. This is in chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. Now Haman, this is egotistical, oh my word, Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor. Have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn and a horse that the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Let one be entrusted to pull him through, one of the most noble princes. The pride-filled and self-absorbed Haman thinks that the king wants to honor him, but it's actually Mordecai being praised. Are you getting the irony here? You see how God works sometimes? Isn't it wonderful? Mordecai, the man who refused to bow down to Haman the haughty, isn't getting hung, but honored. God's good. Haman has to honor his foe, not hang him. I love God's sense of irony and humor. Okay, let's skip to the finale. That doesn't mean we're skipping to the finale of the message. We're just skipping to the finale of the story. At the second banquet, Queen Esther begs the king to save her and the Jewish people from annihilation. In front of Haman, the fearful Esther reveals to the unsuspecting king Haman the conniver, right? Haman's plot. Let's read. This is now chapter 7, verses 5 through 10. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. Who? Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Esther replied, "The wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace, before my very eyes?" As soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered his face, Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a gallows that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to hang Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." Whose side's Harbona on? It's obvious to me. "Then hang Haman on it," the king ordered. So they hung Haman on the pole. He had set it for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Again with the irony. First, by begging for his life, Haman, the humiliated now, destroys any chance of living. Then Haman, the schemer, is hung on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. And to top it off, Haman's mortal enemy, Mordecai, replaces Haman as second in command. None of these schemes came to fruition. The only thing left to deal with was Xerxes' irrevocable, irreversible edict for the Jewish genocide. And now's a good time to remember that old Yiddish saying, when you have two options, take the third. With great tact and skill and wisdom, Mordecai and Esther guide King Xerxes into granting a follow-up edict, giving the Jews the right to not only defend themselves, but also destroy and plunder, take all their goods of any who attack them. Haman's expectations of the Jewish people being slain have been turned into an unexpected outcome of the Jewish people slaying 75,000. 75,000 of them. And by the way, this story took place 2,500 years ago, but the tomb of Mordecai and Esther remain to today. It's still there. But catch this. In 2011, the Persian government, which we now know as Iran, closed the tomb because they spun the Purim story into a tragedy for their own people by saying that the Jews massacred 75,000 of them without cause. Listen, this is ironic because it validated the actual story they were likely trying to forget. And them doing this and actually having these tombs tells us that the story of Esther is an accurate and an actual historical event. But back to the biggest irony of all. God, who has the biggest role in the story, is never mentioned, not once. We find no mention of prayer or religious belief except for fasting. We only see a seemingly random series of events that just so happen, coinkydinks, that are luckily weaved together into a grand design. These are not coinkydinks. These are coincidences. God's in charge. God is in charge. Over and over again throughout the story and in our own lives, I would assume, the invisible finger of God is intervening and orchestrating events in unseen ways as he delivers his people from extermination. Although never stated, it's obvious that he is indeed in control of the entire saga. Listen. God is sovereign. Chance is not. God is sovereign. Chance is not. Just as we read in Proverbs 16:33, NIV, The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. The NLT. We may throw the dice, but the Lord determines how they fall. The Living Bible. We toss the coin, but it is the Lord who controls the decision. And the Message. Make your motions and cast your votes, but God has the final say. Amen? Amen. Okay, let's review the major just so happens and coincidences. A deposed queen and a beauty pageant brings our hidden and beautiful heroine to the king's attention. Mordecai just so happens to overhear a plot and can now get word to the king through Esther. Xerxes has divine insomnia after a meal that Esther serves. And I don't think it had anything to do with Esther's culinary skills. Xerxes is reminded of the unrewarded Mordecai, which eventually leads to Haman's dizzyingly fast downfall. And those on the verge of genocidal extinction, annihilation, instead prosper. So what are our takeaway lessons from the Esther story? First and foremost, that God is in charge and can be trusted. That God is in charge, seen or unseen, evident or not. And if we place our trust and faith in Him, we can overcome our fears. God is with you. Believing is seeing. God is with you. And if we have faith, our fears can be overcome. Now, from Mordecai, we learn about godly character, loyalty, patience, integrity, persistence, and trust and faith in the Lord. And all those things are pretty hard. Patience, persistence, trust, faith. By the way, Mordecai was my dad's Hebrew name, and it means warrior. It means warrior. Okay. From Haman, we learned that placing personal desires and agenda, before the good of others often brings downfall and destruction. Haman feared Mordecai because Mordecai didn't fear Haman. Mordecai had faith. He didn't need to fear Haman. That didn't mean he didn't need to get into action, but he didn't fear Haman. And in his fear, Haman brought ruin and disaster not only on himself, but his family and 75,000 others. So let me remind you, when we serve God, it's about others. It's about others, not ourselves. When we serve God, it is about others. But sinful disobedience is only about ourselves, our self-seeking selves, serving ourselves and our own arrogant pride, ego. Pride and ego tricks us into believing in the lie that we have no need of God. We got this. That we are actually better than we are. That we have no need to grow and mature spiritually and emotionally in our faith. So please be wary and don't underestimate the sin of pride and ego's destructive and distorting power. And please also be aware that the devil is active and participatory just like God is. And those little whispers that he puts in our ears can control our behaviors, can run our lives, can ruin our lives and the lives of others. Now, I'm sure most of you know who C.S. Lewis is. And this is how he defines pride and ego. Ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration on the self. It gets no pleasure in having something, only out of having more of it than the next man or woman. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good-looking, but they're not. They're proud of being richer, cleverer, or better-looking than others. Now, on the other hand, from Esther, we have some lessons. We learn about humility. We learn about obedience. We learn about acceptance. We learn about trust. And we learn about patience and faith. When faced with the fearful decision of she had to make and do, She leaned into her faith. One article says that, like Esther, many of us have found ourselves in unpleasant, painful, or difficult circumstances. Can anybody identify? I'm the only one? But unlike our Jewish heroine, often our natural inclination is to try to find our own way out of those circumstances. And sometimes when it's not possible, we become angry or bitter and fearful. But the story of Purim challenges us to respond differently, the writer continues. God used a beauty pageant and a case of insomnia to bring about the deliverance of his people. Who knows what God may use in your life? Who knows what God may be using in your life? Have faith. Because sometimes we just don't see how God is with us in the storm because he lets it continue past the point where we would have brought it to an end, don't we? This is where I wanted to stop, Lord. But it doesn't, and we have to keep going on. He lets it continue past the point where we would have stopped it because his timelines don't go according to our expectations. He allows us to go past so that maybe we become desperate and fearful and find that the only option is to call on his name and grow closer and more reliant on him, to lean into our faith. Whereas if it stopped right there, guess what? I don't have to change anything. I'm fine just as I am. Thank you very much. And as the book of Irony closes, Esther and Mordecai write to all the Jewish leaders and ask in chapter 9, verse 28, these days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. The festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. They were still celebrating this when Jesus was around. As a matter of fact, most scholars believe that in John chapter 5, he goes for a festival. This is the one. This is the one. And they wanted all the Jews to remember this. Why? As a reminder to fear not. How many times does the Bible say fear not?
A lot.
A lot. And since Dan does not remember, it's 471 times in the English Standard Version. Fear not. Fear not. It's a reminder to fear not. And we had to read all the way through to the end of the story in order to see God's plans. We didn't catch it throughout until the end, and we see, okay, the entire story we don't always see. We want it to end here, but it goes further. And we learn and we listen. And the story is retold every year in Jewish homes and synagogues to help remember God's active participation, presence, provision, power, and protection, and promises in life, even if we can't see it. Even if. Because actually in the end, the book of Esther, the book of Irony, is actually the book of hope. It's the book of hope. The Bible is clear that the unseen hand of our invisible God is overseeing all of our circumstances, each of our circumstances. And we have a role to play. Just because God's in charge doesn't mean he doesn't want us to be doing something. Especially in times like today. And when God's activity isn't obvious to us is when our trust and our faith comes into play. That he's actually written a wonderful ending to our stories. Rough in the middle, good beginning, rough in the middle, hits the climax, and then life gets good. And then life gets good because he's got a love story for us. And as the worship team comes up, for over 2,000 years, Purim has been festively celebrated with feasting, parties, and laughter and joy because God has turned despair into hope and confirmation into his salvation. God may be hidden throughout our own story, maybe just too often, just as it was in Esther's story. But rest assured that his compassionate presence is always there because God so loved the world, that his grace permeates our relationship with him. And if you've never had opportunity to enter into that relationship of his compassionate love, I hope you'll see me after the sermon, after we close. I'd love to talk to you about it. And so, rather than despising our difficult circumstances in fearful and cuckoo times such as these, we can rejoice in them because God uses the storms to grow and strengthen our faith muscles. So as the trials of life hit them, let them be faith builders as you turn to, trust in, and put your faith in God.